I don't think people will turn against me, at least not by themselves. I like people. The public scares me, but people I trust.
We human beings are strange creatures and still reserve the right to think for ourselves.
I was never used to being happy, so that wasn't something I ever took for granted. You see, I was brought up differently from the average American child, because the average child is brought up expecting to be happy.
You see, the trouble is a sex symbol becomes the thing. I just hate to be a thing. I'm nobody's thing.
Fame has a special burden, which I might as well state here and now. I don't mind being burdened with being glamorous and sexual, but what goes with it can be a burden.
I'm nobody's thing. I'm nobody's thing. I'm nobody's thing. I'm nobody's thing.
Let's talk about her house first. So, this was a property she had purchased for $75,000 in Brentwood, Los Angeles. It was near the beach, it had plenty of room. It was, a lovely home for a superstar. Okay, so who have we got there? Well, we've got Mrs. Murray, the housekeeper, Marilyn herself, we've got Dr. Greenson, and often there's a handyman who makes an appearance to do the odd job here and there. And various people actually would come and go from that house. The housekeeper had her own room, so sometimes she would stay overnight. There were spare bedrooms for friends to stay over. Her hairdresser and her stylist were very often there, even though she had fired them and then rehired them. They stayed with her, stayed loyal. And especially now she needed them more than ever, because a picture had appeared in the newspaper 2 weeks before she died of Marilyn with scraggy nails and overly bleached hair. It was starting to break off a bit. She'd lost a lot of weight, so she needed a bit of work before she left the house if she was going to walk down the street. There were discussions at the time between her house staff and her doctor. They were concerned she was becoming agoraphobic. She seemed to become terrified of going outside. And the interview that you're hearing, it's from 2 weeks before her death, as I said, and that journalist would be the last member of the press allowed into her home. He describes that he arrives, he sets down his tape recorder, and in typical style, he has to wait a long time for her to appear in the living room. Eventually she does, and she is dressed in like a really overly large dress, basically to cover up her thin frame. She's wearing sunglasses, and he will say he couldn't be sure, but it might have been a wig. He said if it was an excellent Marilyn Monroe wig she was wearing. I sort of want her to enter the room and be like, boo boo be doo. I know she wasn't really in the state to do that, but I just think that if I had that noise associated with me, it's totally how. I would pick up the phone. I wouldn't be like, hello. I'd pick up the phone and be like, boo boo be doo. So let's get to the date in question. Her publicist had stayed with her on the Friday night, the 3rd of August, and had woken up late on Saturday the 4th of August. This annoyed Marilyn, apparently, because she hadn't slept much, she was moody, and she was really overtired. So the two women, they were planning to go and sunbathe all day, and then they would go to a dinner party later in the evening. Now, what was her mood like on the day? Well, it changes depending on who you believe, who you ask, who you talk to. Mrs. Murray says that she started the day in a fine mood. As she was going about her housekeeping duties, she said Marilyn was chirpy around the house, and she commented that she had a few phone calls to make that day. Fine, she was in a good mood. At one point, Marilyn calls Dr. Greenson, sort of early afternoon, and he comes down, and they go into her bedroom for about an hour, lock the door, they talk, and at the end of it he comes out and he says to the publicist friend, look, you better go home. Marilyn doesn't need you around today. I've suggested she takes a walk by herself to the beach, get some fresh air, cheer up Charlie. So the publicist leaves. They say goodbye at the door, and never could this publicist, who'd been with her for years now, imagine that would be the last time she would ever see Marilyn Monroe. This is a weird detail, but during the day a box arrives at the home addressed to her, and it's a stuffed toy, and it has no note with it. Odd that arrives, but it's enough to send her into an absolutely furious mood. The housekeeper will say the whole mood of the house changed. Something in that stuffed toy had really upset her. The stuffed toy, by the way, has never been explained. It still exists, but it's just never been explained. Nobody ever knows where it came from. So, as the afternoon goes on, Marilyn's in and out of her bedroom, and when she's in the room, she locks the door. Now, there's a spare room next to hers, and it's what's called the telephone room. It's got multiple phones in it, and she drags one of these into her bedroom to make some phone calls. And now we're about to get into the missing hours in the afternoon. Often when the story gets told, it jumps to 7 o'clock at night when she's making phone calls. But there is a gap in the afternoon, and what happened in that gap is so interesting. It wouldn't be revealed until 1983, 21 years later, that she'd had a visitor that afternoon. And that visitor was Bobby Kennedy. They were inside Marilyn's room for over an hour with the door locked. How many people saw him there? 2. Dr. Greenson and Mrs. Murray. Did they ever mention this? No. Of course not. It was Bobby bloody Kennedy, for God's sakes. He didn't just go around saying that he'd popped round in the afternoon. They were told to keep their mouths shut, and they did. So how do we know he was actually there? Because in 1985, when the case was still being investigated, a police deposition that had been hidden for years came to light. It was from a police interview that Bobby Kennedy did in the days after her death, and he admitted that he had visited her that day. What else? What else did Bobby say? Well, he said that she was on edge and that he suggested to Dr. Greenson that they give her a sedative to calm her nerves. Now, for Dr. Greenson, that's easy. He dished out sedatives like they were M&Ms. Do you know what I mean? He was like handing out sedatives all over the shop. But apparently she didn't want it, and she struggled. This is what Bobby Kennedy tells police in that same deposition. He says, I had to sort of hold her still while we injected her. It was just easier that way. When I left, she was fine. And apparently he said he promised that he would call her later to check, but that phone call would not come. However, many times in the day she would ask the same question.
Did he call?
So you might be thinking, well then, did police just interview everyone that knew Marilyn Monroe after she died? Did they ask everyone these questions? No, they didn't. So how on earth did they manage to figure out that he'd been there? Because she'd made a phone call to her hairdresser straight after he left and said that he had been at the house and he'd threatened her, and she was crying down the phone apparently. She said, Bobby's been here and he's just threatened me. Now, interestingly, none of that gets mentioned in the days after her death, and we'll soon see why. The next phone call that we do know about is the actor who had invited her for dinner that night. He phoned her to see if she was going to come to the dinner party, and he says she sounded strange on the phone. Drunk, he thought. And she said the infamous words to him, say goodbye to the president, say goodbye to yourself, because you're a nice guy. That was 7 o'clock. At 7:30 she spoke to Joe DiMaggio Jr., her stepson, and he says she was bright and cheery. She was bright as a button. She was chipper, she was cheery, and when he told her that he'd broken up with a girlfriend that Marilyn wasn't keen on, he said she cheered with joy and said, "We must go to lunch next week to celebrate." Okay, what the fuck? That's 2 phone calls in an hour with 2 completely different stories and different versions of what mood or state she was in. Okay, and if you like your true crime ever changing, if you like a story with multiple versions, get ready. Dr. Greenson leaves the house and he tells Mrs. Murray, look, you better stay the night because she's pretty upset and she might need help in the night. Mrs. Murray claims this. She would see Marilyn alive one more time, and it would be at 8 p.m. in the kitchen. She said the last thing she saw was Marilyn taking a phone into her bedroom and locking the door behind her. At 10 p.m, the housekeeper goes to bed and goes to sleep. Now, she wakes up at 1:30. She gets up to go to the toilet and she notices a light on under Marilyn's door, and she approaches it. And I'm quoting, she says, "It was the light under the door which alerted me that something was terribly wrong." Marilyn Monroe was well known to call friends at 3 a.m, 4 a.m. in the morning regularly, and the housekeeper knew this. So why on earth does the light under the door bother her? Anyway, it does, and here's what she does. She calls Dr. Greenson to the house. He arrives about 1:40 a.m. The room's locked, of course, so they go outside and they look through her bedroom window and she's lying still on the bed. They panic. They go back inside and they call her physician, Dr. Engelberg. He arrives at 1:55 a.m. And the 3 of them, they go back outside, they look through the window. Yep, she's still on the bed. Yep, she's still lying still. They call the handyman. At no point has anyone called the police. No, we'll just keep calling various people to come and look at her lying still on the bed through a window. The handyman smashes the bedroom window and they get into the room. Dr. Engelberg feels for a pulse. He can't find one, and at 2:30 he announces she's dead. So as we all know, she's naked on the bed, she's got a telephone in her hand, and there's a pill bottle next to her. And on the nightstand there's about somewhere between 12 and 16 empty pill bottles. The 4 people are now sort of looking at her dead. The housekeeper, Dr. Greenson, Dr. Engelberg, and the handyman. Eventually they called the police. 2 hours later, they call police at 4:20 a.m. So what happened in those 2 hours? Did they just stare at her body for 2 hours, or did something else happen? 2 police officers arrive and they immediately seal the house shut and they wait for a detective. Detective Jack Clemens is the first man to arrive on the scene. He gets warned what he's about to see, and he goes into the bedroom. He looks around and he asks who found the body. And then he gets told the story of the housekeeper gets up, she phones so-and-so, 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 they look through the window, they break the window, get in. The detective looks at the bedroom window and it's been, fixed almost. It's been boarded up. All the broken glass has completely disappeared. It's been perfectly fixed by the handyman. When was there time to do that, he thinks. He asks this, which is such a good question, such a good detective question. He asks, when did you move the body? Was it recently or was it when you found her? He says the 4 of them freeze in shock. They don't know what to say. They start to stutter. We didn't move her. And he says, well, you must have. You must have, because people who overdose, they don't look like this. People who overdose, they writhe around in convulsions. They vomit all over themselves. They generally don't lie perfectly straight with their legs out on a bed. But the four insist she wasn't moved. No way, we did not move her. As he continues round the room, Sergeant Clement asks for the time of finding her, and he's told 1:30 by the housekeeper. So he's fixated now on this 2-hour window when they didn't call police. Why? What were you doing? Dr. Greenson jumps in and answers this question. He says, well, what we had to do was phone the studio. We had to ask them what to do because there's going to be so much publicity that we needed advice. Sergeant Clemens, he's not enjoying this. It doesn't take 2 hours to make a phone call, he says. Then he notices something that he asks the crime scene photographer to take a picture of, and it's her bedside table. And it's not what's on the bedside table, it's what's not on the bedside table. There's no glass of water, or in fact any liquid. There is not a single drop of liquid in her room. How's she supposed to have swallowed enough pills to kill herself without anything to drink? Then he asks another excellent question. This man, honestly, brilliant. He asks the bathroom question. He says to Mrs. Murray, there's a bathroom in your bedroom. You've got an ensuite. Why on earth would you at 1:30 in the morning get up to go to another bathroom in the house when you saw the light? And she says, I don't know, I must have just been a bit dazed and confused. And that's what it was. Then he asks this, another jackpot. Surely there's a master key for the room. So when you couldn't get in and you saw her lying still through the window, couldn't you just find the master key and open the door? They say, no, we don't know where those keys are kept. Sergeant Clemens, not aware that this hour in his life is going to change everything the rest of his life forever, is suddenly relieved of his duties. A more senior detective arrives to take over the scene. Okay, who's this man? Who's this more senior detective? Well, he's Detective Marvin Iannone. And Detective Iannone happens to be a close family friend of who? The one and only Kennedy family. Now, we've probably all seen the stretcher image of her body being taken out of the house, and by now the headlines are starting. The crime scene's being combed over, it's being photographed, and the interview with the four who were there begin. And this is where the major issues arrive. It's where the stories begin to change wildly. The first major change, and probably the most significant. Mrs. Murray tells investigators she didn't see the light under the bedroom until 3:30 a.m. Then she goes through the stages of calling the various people, and they break the window, get into the room. So these missing hours, they've gone. They've just disappeared out of the story. Here's another huge issue police have. A neighbour has reported that an ambulance and 2 police cars had arrived at 10 p.m. the night before and then left quickly. Somebody, either inside that house or somewhere else, had called an ambulance to her property at 10 p.m. Did she call it herself? Was one of the questions. Well, how you'd answer that question is you'd look at her phone records, but this is interesting. Her phone records from that evening have mysteriously vanished. Can't be found anywhere. Was there a record of this ambulance and the police being called? No, it wasn't written down anywhere. So it's really only in the neighbour's mind. Maybe the neighbour's confused. Maybe he's thinking of another house or another day. The neighbour will say, no, I'm definitely sure. When your neighbour's Marilyn Monroe and an ambulance arrives at 10 o'clock at night, you tend to notice that. You don't really forget it. But the neighbour doesn't really talk to the police much more than that. Most of the things that the first detective is troubled by are now being fixed. Suddenly, a glass of water appears on the nightstand. It wasn't there before, but it is now. The investigators are really perplexed. The whole scene is just not adding up. One of the most confusing questions and the never answered question is this. Where was the diary? This diary containing all the key information, where was it? It was gone. The locked drawer had been opened and the diary was nowhere to be found, never to be seen again. Very quickly, news of her death reaches her 3 husbands and they all have a very different reaction. First husband, Jim Doherty, says it's a real shame what happened to her, what they did to her in Hollywood. Second husband, Joe DiMaggio, he flies to LA, he locks himself in a hotel room and he won't speak to anyone, he awaits the funeral. And Arthur Miller, when asked by press, would you like to say anything about the death, he says no. No, I wouldn't. The 3 men, they wouldn't really speak for years to come about their marriages to her or her death. Back at the crime scene, the coroner has examined her body. He's found traces of drugs and rules that it's a probable suicide. There's evidence of pills in her system. And generally he's thinking that over a period of time, she's taken enough drugs this one day, and they've absorbed into her body and eventually it's killed her. Because you see, these empty bottles would suggest that she might have taken 30, 40 pills to kill herself that night, but yet her stomach is empty, completely empty. There's nothing undigested in there. Also, her hips are covered in bruises, which show that there might have been a struggle or that she might have been injected. You could never say. These bruises were too hard to tell if they were a print from someone's finger or were they injection marks. Now, we could go down the road of conspiracy theories until the cows come home. So I'll just cover quickly the main ones. The best theory that can be linked to the actual physical evidence is that both Dr. Engelberg and Dr. Greenson accidentally gave her an overdose. By not communicating properly with each other, they actually gave her a lethal combination. Now, how does that link to physical evidence? Well, without the pills actually in her stomach, but a huge amount in her system, they could have been giving her pills throughout the day, they've just become absorbed, and they've just not realised what they've done, and they've gone, shit, we've given her way too much, and we've not spoken to each other about it, and we've killed her. In the investigation, Dr. Greenson would admit that he had ordered the housekeeper, Mrs. Murray, earlier in the day to give Marilyn an enema. It was a very, very, very popular at the time. It was very, very popular for celebrities to absorb their pills without swallowing them by the process of an enema. So how do we know that that happened? Well, the autopsy showed that she had a swollen colon. Now, the question is, would the bedroom not have needed cleaned up? Would there not be evidence of it in some form? Yeah, there would, but there wasn't any. That's when the first detective's notes become really important. He notices, as he's walking around the house, that there's damp washing at 5 a.m. He asks Mrs. Murray, "Why is there damp washing at 5 a.m? Were you washing something?" And she says, I must have just been on automatic pilot and just done a washing. Yeah, sure, okay. So blood samples are taken at the autopsy, many organ samples are done, and they're stored away safely. Well, not that safely, because the day after the autopsy, our samples vanish from the lab, and they are never to be seen again. Missing blood samples, missing diary. There sure is a lot of bad luck in this investigation. It only takes a couple of days for the newspapers to start questioning the death, and so what begins there is what we're still dealing with today. The messiest investigation ever. Stories of a cover-up by the Kennedys. They wanted her dead because she knew too much. Stories that the Kennedys in fact had nothing to do with it, that it was purely because she'd been at dinner parties with Arthur Miller and she had been given tips by secret agents and she learned information which could damage America. Then we get to the weirder, the more slightly wonderful ones. Jackie Kennedy had ordered the murder. The rest of the family knew nothing about it. Another weird one is that Marilyn knew too many things about UFOs and had to be killed. Imagine that. Imagine that's what was in that diary all along. Dear diary, there's some exciting developments with UFOs. And of course, and this is the least popular, it might have actually just been suicide. Nobody really likes that theory, I don't think, but what if Norma had just reached the point in her life when she thought, okay, I've never gotten this right the first 3 times I've tried it, because I've tried taking all these pills all at once and, I always get found. What if I, throughout the day, take enough pills to make sure that when I go to sleep tonight, I'm not waking back up? Many people to this day will still uphold that that is the truth. Many more will say that's ridiculous. She never wanted to die. So for years there's no more evidence. It's just all lots of talk and conspiracies and books and documentaries. And in 1985, the BBC make a documentary with Mrs. Murray, the housekeeper. And it would seem like this is just another trawling over the details of the day. Tell your story to the camera. What time did you wake up? What did you see? Who did you call? And in lots of ways, that's what it is. Until the cameras stop rolling and, still wearing her microphone, Mrs. Murray says out loud, not particularly to anyone, just out loud, why, after all these years, do I still have to cover this up? The reporter who's been interviewing asks her, what does she mean? She says, you know fine well what I mean. When asked if there was a different story to the one that she'd told on camera, Mrs. Murray says, look, I've just always told what they told me to say. I've just said what I was told to say. She would never elaborate on who the they were. Was the they the doctors? Was it the Kennedys? Was it the CIA, FBI, police? Who knows? This documentary, it went on to win awards, but interestingly, it was never allowed to be screened in America. The rest of the world, yes, but banned in America. Mrs. Murray died in 1994, and she only ever said one more thing on tape about that evening, which is just so chilling. She said, I can tell you one more thing. She was alive when the doctors arrived. Mrs. Murray would admit this. An ambulance had arrived at the house that night. Marilyn was still alive, and the ambulance had been sent away. I mean, that is gutting, that fact. The fact she could have been saved. But who called the ambulance? Of course, we're never going to know that. Other bizarre things to have emerged over the years are things like the secret box that Dr. Greenson kept, and it was found only when he died. Having been her doctor for a long time, he had a box of clippings about Marilyn from every newspaper. Photos, he had letters between them, pens, things she touched. He had this incredible collection. Now, he'd begun this when he was her doctor and he was seeing her on a daily basis. So weird. A bit like the Joe DiMaggio thing of, even though she's there in front of him in human flesh form, he's still secretly collecting all this memorabilia about her and storing it away. Very strange. And talking of belongings and all that kind of goes with it, there is a Marilyn Monroe estate. She left her money to her acting coach, and it was recently sold. The Marilyn Monroe estate was sold for $30 million to another company. But I mean, that figure doesn't even start to reflect the amount of money her short life has created. Mariah Carey famously bought the baby grand piano from Marilyn Monroe's home for almost $1 million. In 2014, the white dress, the one from the Subway grate, sold at auction for $5 million. So, if we journey back to where I started, this last interview given 2 weeks before her death, I've figured out what it is that fascinates me. It's the tense that she uses. It's the fact that 2 weeks before her death, she's kind of already talking in the past tense. There's almost this like defeated mid-30s woman in there. Not a fighter, just defeated. This interview is in some ways so reflective. And it's not preachy, which I think is lovely. She doesn't preach about it.
You're always wishing and wanting for something. When you get what you want, you don't want what you get. I'm not calling myself an orphan, but I was brought up a waif. I was never used to being happy, so that wasn't something I ever took for granted. You see, I was brought up differently from the average American child, because the average child is brought up expecting to be happy. That's it. Successful, happy, and on time.
But even now, 2020, we have all these celebrities, there's about to be, or it might be out already, but, Hillary Clinton's going to do a big Tell the Truth Netflix series, and we have all these exposés and people saying truths, and I wonder if a lot of that has come from Marilyn Monroe. A lot of it's about tell the story while you're alive, because at least you then get to tell it your way. But do yourself a favour, if you haven't listened, just even listen to a 2-second clip. There's something really raw and honest in this interview, and even all these years later, something in her voice sort of makes you sit up and listen. And I wonder if her words are so interesting because we know how fragile she was, or is it because we know the tragic end that's coming in our direction? And then I questioned all of that. I came back to the place where, yes, of course, she's utterly stunning, but looking at pictures of her, it's quite creepy. It's just, I don't know, there's something about it, and when you hear her voice, I think it's creepy as well. I wonder if it's the push and the pull between sex symbol and actress, and those two things going hand in hand, or is it the rise from the girl in the orphanage to the biggest star in the world, and how much of it she was responsible for and how much of it she wasn't. So I don't really know if I've answered my question. I guess I'll not know why to other people she's so famous, but I think for me it might always be about the shortness of her life. I mean, she reflects and she talks in that final interview like someone in their 80s would. And her life was just so short. There's a resignation in it. There's a loss of sparkle. And ultimately, we will never escape the image of her. It's impossible to do. Well, it is for me, anyway. I look at those old images, and even in the biggest smiling images, there's just a tragedy in her eyes. But that is enough of me talking. Let's allow her words to speak for herself, and let me just say a big thank you to all the female extras who lent their voice to these episodes.
I look at my life and I think I've missed the boat. Everyone else is on the boat, but I'm not there. Changeable.
Remember, you're not a star.
I don't think people will turn against me.
Love, Meredith. I'll always be Norma to you.
Here's the reason why. Because after you get what you want, you don't want it.
I'm not calling myself an orphan, but I was brought up a waif.
Don't want all this. I never did.
I didn't realize the value of a sweatshirt in those days, and then I was sort of beginning to catch on, but I didn't quite get it because I couldn't really afford sweaters.
I'm one of the world's most self-conscious people. I really do have to struggle.
On the days that I'm recording a musical number, I try to make more contact with these people around me because I need to feel happier. I could easily be alone. It doesn't bother me to be alone.
I'm late. I guess people think that why I'm late is some kind of arrogance, and I think it is the opposite of arrogance.
You'll grow tired of me, 'cause after you get what you want, you don't want what you wanted at all.
I didn't know a great deal about Marilyn Monroe before I started this process, and now I'm really glad I did. And so ends the story. This is a bonus track I've made like I was DJ, like actual Calvin Harris. Boom, 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 doom, doom, doom. Enjoy.
It didn't affect me really one way or the other.
Who the hell? Sorry. Fuck. I'm so terrible. Okay. Who the hell does she think she is? Marilyn Monroe? Oh, I've been watching too much Drag Race. That was my queen persona there. Who the hell does she think she is? Marilyn Monroe? I don't know if I can do that one. Okay.
Norma left the how do you say the word? Municipal? Was that, what did she work in? What was the factory? A municipal factory? No. Munitions, that's the word. Try again.
You have to run, like get the fuck out of Dodge.
Imagine being 10 years old and your mother-in-law is... Mother-in-law? At 10 p.m. the housekeeper... Hello? Who?
Hi. How are ya? Are you well? Are you good? I am. Okay, and then what's the other thing you do at the beginning where you're like, okay. No, okay, let's go. Feel free to use that. Bye.
Let's get it on. Let's do it. Let's get it over.